The hungry silence. The air here in the Blackwood Forest was always heavy, rich with the musk of damp earth and pine. But this was different. Tonight, it was suffocating. Not the familiar humidity, but something much more sinister. Old Man Hemlock, the unofficial patriarch of the annual Blackwood camping trip, squirmed in his fold-up chair. He had been visiting this forest for more than 50 years and had watched her moods change from benevolent to surly and back. But he had never seen anything like this. Quiet, isn't it? His wife, Martha, whispered, her voice hardly a tremor in the cloying silence. Even the crackling fire sounded muffled, its flames swirling weakly. Hemlock grunted in agreement. This hour was when the forest usually throbbed with life. The chorus of crickets, the hoot of owls, the scampering of unseen animals in the brush. All this, music of the night. But tonight, only silence. That unnatural, foolproof silence that pressed against the eardrums was a solid thing. The other members of their group, old friends, most of them veterans of innumerable Blackwood expeditions, fidgeted around the campfire. Sarah, an ebullient woman with a booming laugh, was whispering to her husband, David, her brow knotted in concern. Mark, the group's jokester, had fallen quiet, uncharacteristically so, his store of camp jokes depleted. Maybe a storm's rolling in, David ventured, attempting to be reassuring, though his voice couldn't muster the conviction. Hemlock shook his head. He knew the signs of a storm. The electric charge in the air, the boiling clouds, the frantic labor of the forest creatures finding shelter. There was none of that. Just this. As night deepened, the silence deepened, became just intolerable. It was as though they were trapped in a vacuum, the lack of sound magnifying the slightest internal sounds, the heartbeat in their chests, the blood coursing through their ears. Then, a scream. What they had transmitted tore out of the suffocating quiet like a lightning bolt, shattering the brittle demeanor of the group. The voice belonged to Ben, the youngest of the bunch, a man typically characterized by his cool and collected nature. He held his head in his hands, his face twisted in pain. "Can't you hear it?" he screamed, his voice raw with fear. It's inside my head." The others looked at him, horrified. "Hear what, Ben? What's wrong?" Her voice shook as Martha asked. Ben didn't answer. He just screamed again, a banshee-like screech that came suddenly to a halt. He covered his ears with his hands, his eyes open and terrified at what he now instinctively, anciently knew. And then blood began to trickle from the space between his fingers. The group collectively gasped as they arrived at this realization. David dashed over to Ben, attempting to tear his hands from his ears. "Ben, what's happening? Let me see." But Ben said no, shaking his head frantically. This time the blood gushed more liberally, splattering his hands and nightmarish face red. And then he fell over, convulsing on the ground. There was panic around the campfire. Sarah screamed a thin, reedy sound that the surrounding silence soon swallowed. Mark shot backward, eyes wide and disbelieving. Hemlock was old, but his movements had been quick, and he pushed through the chaos to get to Ben. He knelt next to the young man, feeling for a pulse. It was a ghost of a sound, hardly detectable. His skin had been pale and sweaty, his gaze unfocused. "We have to get him out of here," Hemlock said, grim-voiced. "Something's wrong. Something terrible." But even as he was saying that, he knew it was already too late. The silence had claimed Ben. As they wrestled to haul Ben, now listless and unresponsive, a sound began to pierce the oppressive silence. At first so faint it was nearly imperceptible. A low buzz that vibrated in their bones. "Do you hear that?" "Oh my God," Sarah said with an edge in her voice. The humming swelled, harmonizing with itself into a distinct tone. It was a high, almost inaudible whine that felt like it was vibrating right inside their skulls. It was a noise that skipped past the ears altogether, tunneling into the head like a malignant parasite. David howled, hand pressed against his forehead. "Make it stop," he cried, his voice cracking. "Please, make it stop." The rest were beginning to feel it too, an increasingly terrible pressure within their heads, a sense that they were being invaded, that their thoughts and memories were being probed and violated. A few people started bleeding from their ears, just like Ben. Hemlock said, with a creepy certainty, what was going on. The silence wasn't empty. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was a whole new thing. It was a presence, a consciousness, feeding on them. An old legend had come to his mind, something from Native American stories handed down through time. It was a story of an entity that lived in the darkest, most forgotten depths of the Blackwood Forest, a creature of pure silence that fed on life itself. It employed the void to hear, to hunt its quarry, and then used the same silence to disembowel them, the inside spilling forth. Indians dubbed it the Whisper Eater. Hemlock stared around at his friends, faces racked in ecstasy, bodies quaking. He noticed the fear they all had on their faces, the understanding that they were up against something much bigger than anything they could comprehend. He knew they wouldn't be able to fight it. They couldn't reason with it. They could only run. Run, he bellowed, his voice breaking with need. Get out of the forest. Run for your lives. He didn't check to see if they followed. He spun and ran, falling over himself among the trees, his old legs churning with new urgency. A constant buzzing sound echoed behind him, an irritating sound that was threatening to drive him insane. He could hear his friends screaming behind him, their cries lost in the suffocating stillness. He didn't dare look back. He knew that if he stopped, if he faltered, the silence would take him too. He ran until his lungs seared, until his legs screamed, until his vision went fuzzy. He kept running until he burst from between the trees into the open field that skirted the forest. He fell to the grass, breathless and shaking. That humming noise was still there, but it was quieter than before, weaker. He had escaped, but there was no escaping it. He would carry a memory of the hungry silence with him always. His friends' faces twisted in agony, their screams snatched by silence, would be burned into his memory until death. He glanced back at the Blackwood Forest, its ominous trees silhouetted against the evening sky. He could feel the Whisper Eater still there, waiting, listening, feeding. And he knew that someday it would have another victim. The forest was silent again. But Hemlock knew better. The silence wasn't empty. It was just hungry. The glowing path. The chill had already penetrated deeply, a dampness that grazed the bones when they first spotted the glow. A mewling, ethereal glow poking its tendril-like fingers through the heavy, prime-valwood-like some creature from a tale of old, beckoning them forward. Mark, being practical, too quickly attributed it to swamp gas, a trick of light. But Sarah, who had an artistic soul and a taste for the mystical, was immediately enchanted. "Look," she whispered, breath clouding in the cold air. "It's beautiful." Mark and Sarah were experienced campers. They had navigated treacherous terrains, weathered cyclonic storms, and looked at the face of nature's naked strength. But this was a different kind of thing. Something disturbingly seductive. The light was coming from a group of bioluminescent mushrooms like they had never seen before. They spread across the forest floor, their caps are dangerous, heaving blue, washing the trees around them and illuminating the area. It seemed to lead deeper away from the beaten path, into the unknown. Daniel, their typically buoyant companion, wasn't sure. "I don't know, guys. We're way off the map. Maybe we should go with the plan." Ever the adventurer, Mark was already moving on. "Come on, Danny. Where is your sense of adventure? We can always turn back." Sarah nodded as she kept her eyes glued through the hypnotic light. "It's just a little detour. What's the harm?" And thus they stepped onto the illuminated road. The further they traveled, the stranger the woods became. They were twisted, gnarled things with branches that hung like skeletal arms to grab hold of them. The air thickened, heavy with the stench of wet ground and something else, some sharpness and metal. The mushrooms swelled their light swelling, all of the woods bathed in an alien sapphire illumination. They flourished in strange contortions, clinging to rotting logs, spiraling up tree trunks, and then erupting straight up out of the ground, producing odd pulsating sculptures. That's when Sarah noticed the other growing on her hand. A minuscule, iridescent blue fungus, settled between her thumb and forefinger. She gasped and recoiled in horror. "Mark, look!" Mark looked at it carefully, brow furrowing. "It's just a mushroom, Sarah. Probably harmless." When he tried to pluck it off, it was firmly embedded in her skin. It is stuck," she said, her voice shaking. "And it's pulsating." He studied the mushroom on her hand once more. It pulsed with light. He gazed down at his hand, horrified. There was another one sprouting on his skin. When he touched it, a little dust cloud of spores puffed up and engulfed his face. The sober Daniel, now scared and thinking that he was all dirty and covered with glowing fungi, desperately brushed his clothes. "We got to get out of here," he begged. "Now!" They started to retrace their steps, but the way they'd come was gone. The woods felt transformed, reconstituted into an alien maze. Panic began to set in. Sarah said, scared, "We're lost." The glowing mushrooms were spreading now, blooming on their clothes, their skin, their hair. An unusual tingling, warmth coursing through their veins, the fungi digging in deep. The way, now utterly hidden in a thick mound of bioluminescent hepatitis, brought them to a gaping mouth in the hillside, aegis to a cobweb of a cave mouth and shrouded in an artificial kind of darkness. "We don't have a choice," Mark said, his voice tight. "We have to go through it." Once inside the cave, the air felt colder, denser. Now the stench was unbearable, a sweet-sour mingling of decay and something revoltingly sweet. The glow from the fungi was hardly penetrative of the black, projecting grotesque silhouettes that slewed across the walls. And then they saw them. Skeletal remains strewn about the cave floor, picked bare by time and scavengers. Skulls with jeweled C's and mushrooms climbed their craniums, their hollows full of gleaming blue light. Their rib cages twisted together with the beating fungi, creating grotesque pieces of macabre art. Sarah put a hand to her chest and gasped, "Oh God, what is this place?" As they moved deeper into the cave, the walls started to alter. What had once been cold, hard rock had turned soft, warmer, something disturbingly living. The walls throbbed with a soft, primal rhythm, like the beating of a giant, sleeping heart. They seemed to be walking through the bowels of a large beast. "This is not rock," Daniel said, his voice close to a whisper. "It's flesh." Then the cave started to bend and fork into a maze of passageways. The air was thick with their own wheezing breaths, magnified by the repeating vaults. Light from the mushrooms cast their faces pale, the horror drifting through their eyes. They were lost, so hopelessly lost, in a maze of living flesh. The mushrooms on their skin throbbed with an intense light, pulsing with the rhythmic beat of the cave walls. They had a weird kinship with the fungi, a sense of oneness, as their lives were slipping away as if they were joining a larger whole, ancient and evil. Mark stumbled and fell against a wall. He was almost completely covered in glowing mushrooms now. His eyes filled with a desperate plea as he stared at Sarah. I feel it," he wheezed. "It's inside me. It's taking over." Her own body completely overtaken by the fungi, Sarah reached out to him, her touch cold and clammy. "We all become part of it, Mark. There's no escape." His mind reeling from paranoia, Daniel started raking his fingers over his skin, desperate to tear the fungi from his meat. He howled, a human voice but not human voice, ancient and primal, echoing in the cathedral of the tunnels. The cave answered his cries, walls contracting, tunnels moving in an effort to hush him. The mushrooms growing atop his body lit up with a blinding light, and then silence. Daniel screamed, and Mark and Sarah could do nothing but watch as his body was slowly consumed by the cave, the walls absorbing him and adding him to the new warped sections of the living cave. That was when they knew they were doomed. They would not ever leave this place. They would be like the skeletons that littered the cave floor, their bodies shattered and devoured by the phosphorescent fungi, their souls trapped here in this living hell. The further the mushrooms spread, the more they took over their minds and bodies, and they became strangely calm. A resignation to the inevitable. They were no longer Mark and Sarah. They were merely vessels, fates of the ancient evil that resided in this very place. The luminous course had lured them to their doom, a last and terrifying transformation into something else. The trees seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the arrival of the next set of oblivious campers who would take the bait of the shimmering blue beacon, luring them into the depths of danger. This would repeat with the forest devouring more souls. And in the cave, the walls throbbed with life, poised to grow. The wrong coordinates. The old Garmin coughed, the screen jumping around in the fading light. Recalculating. It was a miserable mantra, more irritating than useful. Goddamn thing, Mark muttered, slapping the device. I told Dave we should have brought paper maps. Remember those, Dave? Before we were all enslaved to the digital overlords. Dave, tangled up in a tent pole, merely grunted. He was younger than Mark, a member of the generation that saw physical maps as products of the past. He trusted technology, and this time perhaps misplaced trust. They were deep in the Adirondacks, farther than they'd ever been before. Mark had imagined a weekend of peaceful forest, crackling campfires and, perhaps, a sighting of a moose. Instead, they were disoriented, frustrated, and quickly losing daylight. The GPS chirped triumphantly at last. Destination reached, it intoned in its mechanical monotone. Mark arched an eyebrow through the Jeep's windshield. Destination? What are you talking about? We're in the middle of nowhere. He drove slowly forward, the Jeep bouncing over a barely perceptible track. The trees thinned, and they broke into a clearing. How eerily symmetrical it was, a perfectly round section of flattened earth. And along the perimeter, statues. Not just any statues. They were hewn from a dark, glassy stone that had an obvious sheen in the right light, like obsidian, and struck from them were elongated, angular figures that had a human-like quality but an unsettling air of wrong. Their arms and legs were too long, their torsos too thin, and their faces, where their faces should have been, was a flat, polished surface. Headless. Mark's spine chilled. He had seen a few strange things in his life, but this was evil at a primal level. Creepy, Dave said, articulating Mark's thoughts. Think they're old? Like Native American old? Mark shook his head. I don't think so. These seem older than that. Older than anything human. They were exhausted, however, despite the unease. The clearing was level, sheltered from the wind, and the GPS, bless its sparkly little heart, said this was their destination. Pragmatism won. They decided to set up camp. As they toiled, a heavy fog began to roll in, blanketing the clearing in a heavy silence. The statues towered over them, silent sentinels turned ominous. The mist swirled around their headless forms. I don't like this, Dave said. His voice was a bare whisper. He kept looking at the statues, concern etching the frabjous nature of his features. Mark attempted to comfort him but started to feel nervous. He went to the fire and tended it, working bare embers into hesitant flames that sprang from wet twigs. As the fire roared, crackling and sending flickering shadows dancing around the clearing, he caught something strange about the statues. He circled one, running his fingers over the smooth, featureless surface where a head should be. It was cold against my palm and pulsing with an odd, insistent vibration. Dave, he shouted, his voice taut. Come look at this. Dave stepped forward, albeit hesitantly, as his eyes flitted around the clearing. Mark pointed to the statue. Do you see that? It's as if the stone reflects the fire, but it doesn't. It's distorting it. Dave peered closer. I guess it's likely just the stone. He shrugged, attempting to dismiss Mark's worries. But Mark had sensed that something was off, terribly wrong. They had a quiet dinner, full of anxiety, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. I was still awake when the night grew dark, the fog thick, the silence deafening. Mark checked his watch. 11:55 p.m. But all of a sudden he wanted to get out, to pack it all up and drive away as fast as they could. But he brushed it off as nerves. He was being ridiculous. Then, just as the second hand swept over the 12 on his watch, it came. The air was thick with a low, guttural chant. It was a noise Mark had never heard before, a deep orchestral drone that sent shockwaves through his bones. He heard it and looked around frantically to find the source. Then he saw it. The statues were moving. They were turning slowly, deliberately, their headless torsos twisted upon their pedestals, their smooth, polished planes now pointed straight at Mark and Dave. The chanting got louder, at a deafening crescendo. Just one, a single word, repeated over and over, a word that felt as though it clawed its way into Mark's brain and buried itself deep inside. And then, the pain. A piercing, burning pain flared in Mark's neck, beneath his skull. He choked, clawing at his throat. Then came a terrible pressure, a tortuous, twisty sensation that threatened to break his own spine. He looked at Dave. Dave was screaming, his face twisted in torment, his hands raking the back of his head. With horror, that turned to sickening horror, Mark saw that Dave's head was turning. He was grinding, slowly, painstakingly, on his shoulders, his face toward his back. Mark attempted to scream. The agony was too great, but he could feel his own head starting to turn. He struggled against it with all his might, but the power was too great. Like invisible hands wrapped around his skull, forcing it to turn against his will. The nearest statue's smooth surface reflected the fire. He glimpsed his own twisted image on its surface, face contorted in horror, his eyes open wide in shock. And he saw something else. A hint of darkness passed through the polished stone. The chanting reached a fever crescendo. The pain grew worse, becoming unbearable. He could sense his neck muscles ripping, his vertebrae scraping against one another. He lay on his side, Dave's head twisted nearly all the way around, glazed eyes blankly staring at the sky. Mark knew he was next. He tightly closed his eyes, preparing for the final, cruel pop. Then, silence. The chanting stopped. The pain vanished. Mark slowly opened his eyes. He lay on the ground, his body numb and his head throbbing. He hesitantly reached up to feel his neck. He could sense the tension, the tenderness, but his head remained turned. He looked around. The statues were still standing there, headless figures in the fog. But they were no longer shouting. They were still, silent. He got to his feet, legs quaking. He looked for Dave. Dave was gone. There was no sign of him, no evidence of a struggle. Just the trodden ground, the silent statues and the spinning fog. Mark realized he had to leave there. His brain spun as he stumbled to the Jeep. His hands shaking so badly he could barely insert the keys in the ignition. He fumbled for them. He fired up the engine and dropped the Jeep into gear. He drove blind through the fog, free of the clearing, free of the horror he had seen. He drove for hours, stopping only when the first rays of dawn started to penetrate the darkness. He discovered a small town and drove into a gas station, his clothes ripped, his face smeared with dirt. He explained what had happened to the attendant of a gas station, but all the man could do was look at him with a combination of pity and disbelief. "You must have been dreaming, son," he replied. "There's no here nothing like that." Mark knew he wasn't dreaming. He knew what he had seen. He knew about what had happened to Dave. For the next several weeks, he attempted to retrace his steps to the clearing, but he was unable to. The GPS coordinates have disappeared, scrubbed from the device's memory. The region he recalled was mere endless wilderness, no different from any other stretch of the Adirondacks. He never revealed the whole story to anyone again. He knew they wouldn't take him seriously. He was left with the memory, the dread and the gnawing certainty that somewhere, deep in the wild, the headless statues still were, waiting for new victims. And at times, late at night, he could still hear the chanting. Dim, far but unmistakably so. A stark reminder of the wrong coordinates and the cost he had borne for trusting a machine. Lullaby of the lost. The earth and old trees of the Redwood National Park filled the air with the perfume of the wet. Under the gargantuan canopy, a perpetual twilight prevailed, dappling the campsite in throbbing patches of radiance and gloom. We were 6 veterans of too many camping trips, attracted to the tranquility of the wild and the friendship built around crackling fires. We thought we knew these woods. We were wrong. It began so subtly, just a thin line of music streaming on the wind. We ignored it, assuming it was the wind blowing through the branches, or maybe the sound of a far-off bird. Sarah, the most musical person among us, first recognized it as singing. A child's voice, high and clear, singing a simple, repeating tune. "Sounds like a lullaby," she said, tilting her head to hear. "Sort of haunting, actually." We all strained to hear, and yes, there it was. A child singing a lullaby. It was far away, even a little dreamlike, but definitely there. Even with a hot fire, a shiver went through me. Probably just some kids camping with their parents on the other side of the ridge. Mark, ever the pragmatist, said, waving it off. And the lullaby carried on, threading through the evening. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't quite right, either. There was something off, a sorrow somewhere in a strange, emotional narcissism impinning at the edges of my mind. It felt wrong. Liam, the quieter of us all, disappeared that night. We missed him at breakfast. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag rolled up neatly. Panic flared. Liam was not the wandering off type. He was fastidious, conscientious. Maybe he went on a hike early. Emily, with an air of manufactured cheerfulness. We scattered, scouring the immediate area around the campsite. We called his name out until we were hoarse. Nothing, and hour by hour, dread tightened in my gut. Something was terribly wrong. Then, Sarah paused, a confused look on her face. "Wait," she said, her voice hardly a whisper. "Do you hear that?" The lullaby. It was closer now, clearer. It appeared to be emanating from deep in the wood, calling us. "He wouldn't," I said, shaking my head. "He would not just follow a song." But when we neared camp, a shape appeared through the trees. It was Liam. He walked slowly, his eyes glazed, his face ashen, gaunt. He didn't call back, didn't know we were there. He just stared out into space, his face blank. And then we heard it. He was humming the lullaby. We ran to him, took him by the arms, and shook him lightly. "Liam, what happened? Where were you?" He blinked slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. "Oh, the song," he sighed with a raspy voice. I needed to follow the song." We got him back to camp, fed him, tried to get him to justify. But he couldn't. He recalled hearing the lullaby, a compulsion to follow it, and then, nothing. He had no memory of where he'd been or what he'd done. He just kept humming. That evening the lullaby rang louder, more demanding. It seemed to thrum through the very earth beneath us. I couldn't sleep. I wriggled in and out of my sleeping bag, the melody echoing in my mind. The following morning, Mark was missing. Then Emily. The same thing happened every time. They vanished, seduced by the call of the lullaby. They'd come back a few hours later, blank-eyed and humming, what happened lost to the woods. Fear turned to terror. We were getting picked off, one by one, drawn into whatever unknown, unknowable horror. We attempted to barricade ourselves in our tents, but it was no use. The sleep call encased everything, crawling into our minds from those very fingers that unlocked the chains of confusion and guided us into a dream of ignorance, a bubble in stagnation. Sarah was next. I knew its power. I'd seen it myself. It was the kid with glazed eyes, slowly ambling down the sidewalk toward the trees that beckoned him with an irresistible melody. I attempted to restrain her, but she shoved me off, her force unexpectedly strong. She mouthed the words of the lullaby. Now it was just John and me. We gathered our gear, scrambling to exit the campsite, to get as much distance as we could between us and the cursed song. But the lullaby trailed after us, borne on the wind, humming in our ears. "We have to get out of here," John said, shaking. "We have to make it to the ranger station." We ran, tripped through the underbrush, our lungs on fire, the lullaby a hum, a malign cloud. Then John froze, his face a rictus of fear, turning slowly toward the trees. "John, no!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. "Don't listen to it. We have to go." But it was too late. His eyes glazed over, a faraway smile creased his face, and he withdrew from me, fading into the thick brush. I was alone. I stumbled back to the campsite, my head spinning and my body numb. The flames had subsided to embers. The tents remained desolate, abandoned. The lullaby was louder, a piercing chorus, like the woods themselves were singing. I crawled into my tent and pulled the sleeping bag over my head, to quiet the sound, the fear, the despair, as if I could block it all out. But it was no use. Now the lullaby was in my head, a torment that was unending, inescapable. Suddenly, I felt it. Tremulous urgency, the need to go to the trees, to follow the song. My body felt no longer mine, controlled by a puppeteer I could not see. I battled it with all the strength I had. I clenched my hands into fists. I bit my lip until it bled. I screamed into the dark. But the lullaby was lulling more, luring me with, what? Peace? Understanding? I couldn't tell. All I knew was I needed to follow it. I crawled from my tent, irresistibly drawn to the trees. But then, as I was about to plunge into the darkness, I halted. I don't know what made it happen. Survival instinct activated or something. Something in my head broke. I could picture my daughter's face, her laugh, her hand in mine. I couldn't abandon her. I couldn't let this thing claim me. With a Herculean act of will, I liberated myself from the song. I backed into the tent, falling to the ground, out of breath. The lullaby still murmured in my skull, but it was a weaker song now, a more distant thing. I remained in that tent for what seemed a millennium, frozen in fear, battling the almost unstoppable urge to follow the song. Finally, when a sliver of dawn broke through the trees, I crawled out, my body battered and my mind shattered. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not giving up until I was at the ranger station. My lungs screaming, my legs on fire. I told them everything. They looked at me with pity in their eyes. They looked through the campsite but discovered nothing. No bodies, no sign of my friends, just abandoned tents and a cold fire. They said I had hallucinated, that I was the victim of sleep deprivation and stress. There was no lullaby, they said. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that out there in the woods, the lullaby remains, waiting for the next one to take the bait. Years later, I still hear it, sometimes. Like a whisper, in a melody only what you can hear, as the wind ruffles the trees. And I know if I listen too closely, if I let it in, I'll be lost forever. I'm sitting here at my quiet suburban home, miles from the redwoods, and I hear it. It is faint, nearly imperceptible, but it exists. A child's voice, singing a lullaby of the lost. And tonight, the lullaby sounds like it's from inside my house. It's in my daughter's room, the door in the trees. Every summer, the camping trip was a ritual for my group, a nostalgic return to the woods we grew up in. All of us were north of 35 now, mortgages and kids had taken the place of youthful indiscretion. But there was still magic in the woods, a temporary escape from the quotidian. But this year, the woods had something different entirely. We drove up Friday afternoon, the old smell of pine needles and loamy soil filling our lungs. As we pulled the cars out, I saw it, an impossibly large structure, deep in the trees. It was a treehouse, but not one we'd built as kids. This was ancient, gnarled, and almost organically fused with the surrounding trees. The wood was a sickly gray, and the whole thing sagged under its own weight like the thing had been rotting for decades. Did anyone see that before? Mark asked, squinting. We all shook our heads. These woods were the back of our hands. A treehouse like that wouldn't have escaped our notice. We sunk to wanting to know how the other side lived, the curious kind that gets you into trouble. As we drew closer, we saw something stranger still. Dotted around the base of the treehouse, and half buried under inches of leaves and dirt, were toys. Old toys. Toys we recognized. A G.I. Joe action figure whose arm was gone, just like the one I'd lost in these very woods. A Barbie doll with wild hair and a worn dress, exactly like Sarah's childhood favorite. What the hell? Sarah whispered, lifting the doll with shaking hands. This is uncanny. So was the treehouse itself, eerily silent. There were no chirping birds, no scurrying squirrels. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air around him. A rickety wooden ladder led to the entrance, a dark, gaping hole in the wall of the treehouse. Despite our rising discomfort, we couldn't help it. Mark, ever the intrepid one, began to climb. We followed, lured by a morbid fascination. It was worse on the inside than we had imagined. The air was heavy with the odor of mildew and last week's shit. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet. The walls of the room were decorated with crude drawings, childish, stick figure renderings, and smiling suns, but somehow they were deeply unsettling. A door stood at the middle of the treehouse. Not a paneled wooden door, but a dark, shimmering void, like a rip in the fabric of reality. An unnatural light pulsed from it, throwing odd, elongated shadows on the walls. "What is that?" Lisa exhaled, her voice a whisper. Before anyone could respond, a voice boomed out of the dark. "Come in," it said, whispering. "We've been waiting for you." It was Mark's father's voice, a voice that none of us had heard since he died years ago. Mark stood frozen in place, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Dad?" he croaked. The voice laughed, low and guttural, sending shivers down my spine. "Come on, son. Don't you want to look at me again?" Despite our protests, Mark took a step towards the door. We each took a step back, but it felt like something beyond our control was pulling him towards us. With one last, panicked look at us, he plunged into the void. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, frozen with fear. Then the door shimmered and Mark came back out. He looked different. His gaze was empty, skin gray and clammy. "Mark, are you okay?" I approached him cautiously and asked. He glanced at me, a weird grin on his face. "I'm fine, John. I've never been better." His voice was not his own. It was my wife's voice, the calming tone she uses when she's trying to soothe our children. "John," Mark, as my wife said, "why don't you come in? It's wonderful here. You'll love it." That's when we knew. Something was terribly wrong. We had to get out of there. We hurried down the ladder without looking back. At the campsite, we grappled with what we had beheld, but words failed us. We were caught between disbelief and stark terror. We knew we were going to leave. We just knew we couldn't leave Mark. When the night fell, we sit together by the campfire with the flames flickering on our faces. We monitored the treehouse from a distance and waited for Mark to come to his senses. He did, eventually. Or rather, it did. He stepped out of the woods and walked slowly toward us. As he approached, we could hear him talking, not in his own voice but in the voices of our loved ones. A chorus of wives, husbands, and parents beckoned us to come to the treehouse, to join them in whatever lunatic paradise waited behind the door. The voice of Sarah's mother, weak and beseeching. "Sarah, darling, come see me. I miss you so much." The voice of Lisa's husband, warm and reassuring. "Honey, you don't want to be with me? We can be together forever." It was quite frankly an irresistible temptation. The voices were so familiar, so comforting, but we knew it was a trap. Whatever was waiting behind that door was not our loved ones, but definitely something else. Something dark and hungry. We attempted to plead with Mark, to talk to the man we knew, but it was to no avail. He was just a puppet, nothing more than a hollow shell moved by things beyond us. As the hours passed, the voices became more urgent, more desperate. They exploited our greatest fears and aspirations, selling us everything we'd ever wanted. We started cracking one by one, but Lisa was sobbing and took a step into the woods. I took her arm and pulled her back. "Ignore them," I begged. "It's not real." But the voices would not be silenced. They bored into our heads, murmuring sweet lies. We were losing control. Finally, I realized we needed to take extreme measures. We had to destroy the treehouse, to cut the link to whatever that thing was that was lurking behind that door. So we grabbed our axes and ran to the treehouse, the crowd roaring around us like a relentless hurricane. As we swung our axes, the wood splintered and cracked. The treehouse creaked, its old wood objecting to the violence. The void in the center of the treehouse shimmered, the voices screaming madly in rage. The air crackled with energy. It was a race against time. Just as the treehouse was about to crumble, Mark lunged at me, his eyes lit with an icy, unnatural glow. He swung a branch with surprising force, sending the axe flying from my hand. I staggered backward and hit the ground hard. He lifted the branch again, preparing to deliver the death blow. But then, something changed. For just a second, I thought I saw recognition in his eyes. The voices stopped. "Run," he said, his voice a whisper. "Get out of here." Then, his eyes grew dim, and he slumped in a heap. The treehouse collapsed around us, the void contracting with a last, world-ending roar. We did not stick around to see what happened next. We took Mark and ran, blindly through the woods. And we didn't stop running until we reached the cars, lungs burning, hearts pounding. We never returned to those woods. We took him to the nearest hospital, hoping he would get better, and that whatever demon had taken hold of him was gone for good. I still hear the voices sometimes, whispering in the back of my head. My wife's voice, my mother's voice, tugging me to return, to join them on the other side of the door. But I know better now. I know some doors should never be opened, some mysteries never solved. Because often what we discover in the dark is far scarier than anything we can ever create. The Marked. The air felt different in Hemlock Hollow this year. Thicker, somehow, clinging to the lungs like wet velvet. Typically it was the crisp autumn air, scented with pine and decaying leaves, that attracted the seasonal campers. This year, it was unsettling. It struck even Dale, the old outdoorsman, as he manhandled his tent poles, the canvas pulling down on him. He looked over at the Jacobs family, still wrestling with their out-of-scale dome tent. Ben Jacobs, normally the very portrait of suburban comfort, was dripping with sweat, his face creased in a frown. His wife, Sarah, kept swatting at imaginary bugs, her gestures jerky and skittish. Their two children, usually bouncing around with irrepressible energy, pressed close to the minivan, their faces pale in the waning light. Dale shrugged. Just first-night jitters, no doubt. He'd seen it 100 times. Yet that uneasy feeling still hung in the air. That night, sleep was fitful. Dale had a vision of twisting roots and thick black mud churning in the soil. He woke with a gasp, his heart kicking against his ribs. The tent felt smothering, infused with the same pull he'd felt before. He scrapes his arm, a strange itch, and that's when he saw it. A symbol was scrawled on his forearm, just above his wrist. A crude, nearly childlike, drawing of a circle that has been divided in half by a jagged line, which is divided in half again by a horizontal slash. It appeared stamped rather than drawn, the skin surrounding the symbol raw and inflamed. He didn't go to bed with it. He was sure of it. He panicked. Had he been sleepwalking? He didn't remember anything. He fumbled for his flashlight and scrambled out of the tent. A bright moon bathed the small, designated camping area in an eerie silver glow that did nothing to relieve the agonizing tension. He could hear the leaves rustling, the hooting of an owl, the familiar nocturnal symphony of the woods. But underneath it all, he felt something different. An unnerving stillness. A held breath. He walked over to the Jacobs campsite, a beam of his flashlight flickering wildly. Ben was sitting outside his tent, staring into the darkness. "Ben, you okay?" What he said in a raspy whisper was Dale. Ben didn't answer. He simply lifted his left hand to reveal a matching symbol carved into his palm. The same crude circle and ragged lines. "What the hell?" Dale said, his blood freezing in his veins. Sarah had come out of the tent, her face a sheet. She shook a quivering finger at their children. They both had the symbol, too, on their foreheads. The next morning, the entire campsite was quiet with subdued terror. All of the campers had woken up with the mark. Some on their arms, some on their legs, some on their backs. A pandemic of whispers spread like wildfire, ignited by fear and confusion. Some wondered if it was a prank. Another person thought it was a mass hallucination. No one dared voice the actual fear that had crept into the back of their mind. That something nefarious was afoot. They made the decision to go into town and report it. Hemlock Creek was a sleepy little town, its main street populated with antique stores and touristy cafes. They found Sheriff Brody with his feet up on the counter at the local diner, a man whose torn and tanned face and relaxed gait usually engendered confidence. But even Brody appeared distressed by the sight of the marked campers. I've never seen anything like this before," he said, raking his hand through thinning hair. "Maybe it's like some sort of cult thing." He sent them to the Hemlock Creek Historical Society, a small, dusty building hidden behind the library. Old Man Hemlock knows all about this town and its history. If anybody knows what this symbol means, it will be him. Old Man Hemlock was an old man, his face a map of lines, with bright, piercing eyes behind thick glasses. He was sitting on stacks of books, yellowed maps, and ancient artifacts. When he saw the symbol, carved into Ben Jacob's arm, his face went pale. He paused for a long moment, and the silence seemed to thicken the dread in the room. At last, he gasped, barely above a whisper, "The Watcher, in the roots." Then he began to tell them a story, a grim and unsettling story that had been told from parent to child and grandchild for generations in these parts of Hemlock Creek. Long before the town was settled, the area had been home to an isolationist tribe. They engaged in a version of nature worship, a communal ritual with the earth and the ancient powers that lived within it. But their worship turned sinister. They started wanting power, to master the natural world, to make it subservient to them. They dug too deep, and found things that should have stayed buried. They attempted to conjure an entity, a fundamental energy they named the Watcher in the Roots, a protector of the planet's most profound mysteries. Here the ritual demanded the sacrifice, a binding of flesh and blood to the land. It just so happened that the very symbol that was etched into their bodies was the key. That was a mark of ownership, a branding for the entity they wished to awaken. The ritual was never finished. Old Man Hemlock replied, voice quaking. The tribe was gone, wiped out by a great unknown disaster. But the mark still exists. A potential tether, a method of waking the Watcher up again. Awaken it? How in the world? Sarah Jacobs asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens then? Old Man Hemlock gazed at her, ancient terror dancing in his eyes. No one knows for sure, yet the legends say it will be horrible. A reckoning. The land will claim its due and reclaim what is owed. And those who carry the mark, they will be its instruments. On the night of the gathering, the earth began to shake. It began as a low rumble, vibrating beneath the soles of their feet. Then it got stronger, more insistent, shaking the trees and rattling windows in the homes in Hemlock Creek. The campers, huddled together for safety, felt a primal fear tearing at their insides. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and something else, something ancient and indescribably foul. Shoes were laced tight, and the ground underfoot quaked. Leaves rustled and nocturnal critters chirped as the forest around them writhed not with foliage but with slow, deliberate motion. Something was digging, something huge. Then, the earth split open. A massive rift screamed open in the middle of the campsite, the earth bending and shattering as something immense started to ooze. Roots, as thick as pythons, writhed up out of the earth, ripping apart tents and crushing everything in their way. And then out of the depths of the chasm, a monstrous shape began to climb. It was monstrous, a grotesque parody of nature. A lumbering mass of dirt and roots contorted into a vaguely human form. Its eyes were empty holes, loaded with an evil green glow. Its mouth was a cavernous hole with rows of jagged rocks. The Watcher in the roots had come to consciousness. The marked campers experienced a strange compulsion, a gravitational pull towards the monstrous creature. The body shook, the mind filled with a single burning desire, to serve. His will fought it, the ancient power trying to devour him. Ben Jacobs stared as he fitfully moved his body toward the Watcher, eyes glazed over like the puppet with the strings cut. He turned to Sarah, whose face was a mask of terror and resignation. He stared at their children, their eyes burning with the same evil green glow. He knew what he had to do. He snatched up his camping axe, its steel cold and familiar in his grip. His heart arched with the worst kind of grief as he ran to the Jacobs family. He had to stop them. He had to sever the tether. He raised the axe overhead, targeting the children's foreheads, where the mark burned like a brand. The ground shook, a series of earthquakes knocking him off kilter again. He missed. The axe glanced off Ben's shoulder, eliciting a scream of pain. A roar rumbled from the watcher, reverberating through the very crust of the soil. Then the world fell out from under Dale's feet. He had fallen into the chasm and had lost his way in the dark. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, breathless. He looked up, into the yawning maw of the watcher. He saw the green light, twisted round, the ancient evil. He felt the draw, the overwhelming desire to yield. But in his last moment, as the watcher grasped for him, Dale found a spark of defiance. He thought of the crisp fall air, the smell of pine, the calm of the woods. He had remembered the beauty of the natural world, the beauty this monstrous entity threatened to obliterate. He lifted the axe, its blade glimmering in the sinister emerald glow. He swung it with all the strength left in him, embedding its head deep in the watcher's heart of earth and roots. Then, everything went black. And whether his act was a difference, whether he had saved Hemlock Creek from the watcher in the roots, he never knew. The town was never the same. The story was made into a local legend. And the mark? The symbol of the watcher? It never returned to Hemlock Creek. But some say that on some dark, windy nights, you can still sense a tremor in the ground, a weak rustle under the roots, a lesson that some things are better left buried. The fog's toll. The old Subaru wheezed and spat, finally giving up the ghost just as the tendrils of fog began snaking through the towering pines. Damn, Sarah said, banging her fist on the dashboard. Of all the times for her car to shit the bed, it had to be now, on this godforsaken road leading up to Blackwood Campground. Wonderful, Mark said, his tone heavy with weary resignation. Just great. Their annual camping trip was already going terribly. The GPS had misled them. They'd fought over directions, and now this. Blackwood was supposed to be a clean break, a return to nature's calm. Instead, it was a prologue for a disaster movie. The fog thickened as they wrestled their gear from the car, devouring the forest in minutes. Not the soft, misty type, either. This fog was dense, viscous, nearly solid. It tasted of damp earth and something metallic, something vaguely wrong. Let's just camp here, Sarah said, forcing some cheer into her tone. Maybe it will be clear by morning. They set up their tent in a small clearing, the fog closing in as though it was wrapping them up in a suffocating blanket. The temperature dropped, and then a thick silence fell, interrupted only by the intermittent drip of moisture from the invisible trees. As night fell, the fog appeared to glow with some eerie internal luminescence. Being the pragmatist, Mark made a fire. Tarpaulins swelled with wind, but the flames fought against the damp, their flickering shadows punishing their eyes. Sarah had a prickle of unease. Something was off, terribly off. They had a quiet dinner, the crackling fire their only company. As they were finishing, a sound sliced across the murk, a dragging, shuffling sound, slow and purposeful. What was that? Sarah whispered, her hand moving on its own to the small hatchet they kept to chop firewood. Mark strained his ears. Probably just an animal. The sound grew closer. It was heavy and labored, like something big and clunky was being dragged through the undergrowth. Then, they saw it. Through the fog stepped a figure, ruined and blurry. It was the shape of a human, but grotesquely contorted. The thing moved with a stuttering, unnatural gait. Its arms dangled limply at its sides. But it was the face that froze them with fear. It was a collection of faces. When layered, one on the other, somehow fused. And each one, no matter how twisted and mangled, was unmistakably theirs. Sarah's face, Mark's face, an awful mosaic of their faces. Before they had the chance to scream, the figure lunged. It was impossibly fast, its touch cold and clammy. Tension gripped Sarah's chest, a new pain, dry, burrowed deep into her bones, through her body. A needle jab of sudden pain, a spike of fire, that burned through her chest and grabbed a hold of her throat, snatched away her breath. Mark yelled, swinging the hatchet, but the figure was faster. It swatted the hatchet aside, its many faces twisting into a horrible, soundless grin. Then, darkness. Sarah sat bolt upright with a gasp. She was in the tent. The fire was still burning. Mark lay asleep next to her, snoring softly. The fog remained, heavy and suffocating. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Mark, something's wrong." He groaned, covering his eyes with his hands. "What? What is it?" I had a nightmare. A terrible nightmare. There was something in the fog." He chuckled. "Too much campfire coffee. Go back to sleep." But Sarah was unable to convince herself that the nightmare had been a dream. The frigid fear still hung. The phantom ache in her heart still pulsed. She glanced down to see a thin, red line running between her breasts. It looked like a scar. With the sun hardly breaking through the fog, they chose to pack up and go. Somehow, the car started on the first try. The road was quiet and the fog was thick, packed inside the ridges of their souls and around their skin, tight as the memory of the nightmare. They drove forever, but the scenery was unchanged. The same towering pines, the same winding road, the same choking fog. "This has to be wrong," Mark said, his voice taut with anxiety. "We must have hit the highway by now." Sarah checked the GPS. It showed them the right road, going the right way, but the numbers continued to reset, revolving around the same coordinates. "We're going in circles," she whispered, the horror returning to her voice. All of a sudden, the car jolted violently. A figure had suddenly appeared in their path. The same figure of her nightmare, the multi-faced monstrosity. Just then, slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure was struck by the car, the impact propelling them forward. Then, darkness. Sarah sat bolt upright and gasped. She was in the tent. The fire was still buried in embers. Mark snored beside her, softly, while he slept. The fog was present again, heavy and smothering. This time, the terror had been too much. She knew what was happening. "We are trapped," she said in a hesitant tone. "We're trapped in a loop." Each time they died, their memories were wiped, but the trauma stayed. The scars on her chest deepened and flared brighter, a map of her previous deaths. Mark, as well, bore the scars of their repetition. A long gash on his arm, parts of his throat shadows with marks, keepsakes from facing their Ruas Pagina de Suceros. They did everything to try and break the loop. They stayed in the tent. They bolted in the other direction. They attempted to wrestle the thing. But every attempt had ended the same way, with the appearance of the figure and with their inevitable death. With every reset, the fog felt thicker, the horror heavier. Their sanity was being eroded, and their bodies transformed into canvases for the fog's waning symphony of horrors. And then one day Sarah woke up with a sliver of memory that wouldn't get out of her mind. A word. A place. The well. And I had read about an abandoned well somewhere near the campground. A place locals talked about in whispers, a place known to be cursed. So they set out to look for it. They staggered through the fog, bodies stripped of strength, minds bent almost to breaking. Finally, they found it. An ancient stone well, its mouth choked with weeds and moss. A strange energy thrummed in the air around the well. The fog swirled about it as if it were attracted to its dark center. The answer lay within, Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. She stared into the void, the reverberation of her own cries ringing in her ears. Then, she saw it. A tangle of faces, reflected in the murky water. Not hers and Mark's, but dozens of other faces, all twisted in fear, all bearing the signs of the toll the fog extracts. And then, she realized, they weren't merely replaying their deaths. They were reenacting the deaths of everyone who had ever been caught in the fog. The many-faced figure was more than their tormentor. It was a figurative muse of all they endured, a grotesque monument to the fog's insatiable appetite. As the figure stepped into the fog, Sarah knew there was only one thing left to do. She took Mark's hand and jumped, and the cold water enveloped them, the darkness closing in. As they sank deeper, She caught the silhouette above them, its many-angled face twisted in a soundless, victorious scream. But then, something shifted. The fog was beginning to clear as they arrived at the bottom of the well. Those looping memories faded, and in their place came an indescribable sense of deep peace. They were free. They broke free from the well, drenched and shaking but alive. Now the haze had dissipated to uncover a spectacular panorama of jade woodlands and golden pastures. They never talked about what went on in the fog. The scars were a reminder, in permanent ink, of their ordeal. But they were no longer captives to the loop. They were free to live, free to forget. But sometimes, when the air was still and the light was just so, they'd catch a glimpse of their reflection, and see, for that fleeting moment, the faces of everyone lost in the fog, stuck with its horrible cost. The bear that wasn't. The rain had been a relentless foe for days now, a perpetual drumming on the tents that sucked the warmth and energy from the little circle of tents. They were experienced hikers who ventured into the remote wilds of the Redwood National Park, lured by the promise of solitude and the beauty of ancient trees. Now, they sat huddled around a sputtering fire, faces gaunt, listening to the wind howl like a banshee through the green spires of the towering pines. Then, he wandered into their camp. He was a mess. His clothes were torn to pieces, his face a mask of mud and blood, and one arm dangling limply at his side. He stumbled toward the fire, moaning and screaming, his eyes wide with a primal sort of fear that made Sarah shiver, even after years of training and experience as a wilderness guide. Bear attack, he panted, then crumpled at the firelight's edge. Two of the stronger men, Mark and David, leaped to his side, assisting him carefully to sit. Sarah crouched next to him, a medical kit already laid out. Easy, friend. We're here. You're safe now. Tell us what happened. The man, who gave his name as Thomas, spoke in gasps, his voice heavy with pain and disbelief. Hiking alone, lost my way, then bear. Big, came out of nowhere, tore up my arm. He weakly gestured to his mangled arm. Fought back, scratched me, bit me. Sarah started cleaning his wounds, her brow wrinkling. The cuts were deep and vicious, like something done with strong claws. But something felt off. The spacing between the gashes was too exacting, their edges too neat, almost surgical. And the teeth marks, they were jagged, but the teeth that had made them, they seemed too sharp, too pointed for a bear. It caught the attention of Mark, a retired police officer. Those are some nasty wounds, Thomas. But they don't really resemble bear attacks I've encountered. Thomas recoiled, his eyes twitching involuntarily. It was a bear, I swear, a huge, rabid bear. He tightened his grip on his arm, as though to protect it. Sarah shot a worried glance at Mark. The narrative seemed thin, the specifics fuzzy. But a guy was hurt, and you don't argue. Her priorities changed to bandaging his wounds, giving pain medication and warming him up. As the hours wore on, the storm grew stronger. The small camp increasingly seemed a world of its own, a delicate bubble of light and warmth surrounded by the great, merciless wilderness. Thomas went in and out of consciousness, mumbling gibberish about the bear, about being lost, about something he sensed but could not see lurking in the trees. By midnight, the fire had begun to die down, and long, dancing shadows had led to tricks being played on their eyes. David was off to fetch more wood, the beam from his flashlight slicing through the downpour like a thin sword. He came back a few minutes later, his face ashen, his eyes large with terror that matched the panic Thomas had felt earlier. His speech has left him, and he just pointed shakily at the trees. He tightened his grip on the stock of his rifle. What is it, David? What did you see? David gulped hard, as if choking on the answer. Eyes. I saw eyes, watching me from the trees. Not animal eyes, something wrong. A cold dread crept into Sarah's bones. This wasn't simply a bear attack gone awry. Something else was happening. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It had come from the middle of their camp. All eyes turned to Thomas. His body was shaking violently, arching and twisting like a fish out of water. The gauze that Sarah had so painstakingly wrapped around him was tearing on his skin, threatening to split open. He moaned like a dog in pain, his voice deepening into low, primal growls, an animal sound that filled them with fear. And that's when the change started. His skin split and cracked, exposing something a bone whiter underneath. From underneath his skin grew feathers that tangled into a sickle-feeding skeletal plumage. His arms and legs stretched long, fracturing and slithering as they reconfigured. His face melted away, giving ground to a beak-like snout and empty, black sockets where his eyes had been. Antlers, impossibly large, gnarled antlers, erupted from his skull, thrusting up through the fraying remnants of his hair. What had been Thomas was now a nightmare of a man, a skeletal horror crowned with antlers that scraped the low branches of the trees. It stood up to full height, looming over the terrified campers, legs awkward and uncoordinated, like a puppet on a string. Mark shot his rifle up, but held himself. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. Something that didn't make sense. It screeched, a sound that shredded the silence, clawing at their sanity. Then, it lunged. Chaos erupted. When Mark fired his rifle, the rounds appeared to go directly through the beast without causing any kind of damage. Sarah screamed, scuttling backward, her medical kit strewn across the muddy ground. David was frozen like a deer in the headlights, frozen in fear. The creature swiped at Mark, ripping its clawed hand through his jacket and into flesh. He cried out in pain as he staggered back. Adrenaline rushing, Sarah grabbed a hatchet from nearby and struck with all her strength at the beast's leg. The blade sank in deep, slicing through bone and sinew. The creature let out another shriek, its body stumbling for a moment. But it didn't fall. It just shifted its weight, its almost alien anatomy compensating for the injury. It trained its gaze on Sarah, its hollow eye sockets apparently piercing her soul. Then, she understood. It had not been a bear that had attacked Thomas. Thomas was the bear. Or more specifically, he had been someone else, someone human, who had been dug through, corrupted, and adapted by the forest. It wore its victims like skins, twisted into mockeries of humanity to serve as grotesque sentinels of forsaken wood. As Sarah backpedaled, the creature lunged, a skeletal hand grasping for her face. Just as she believed she was about to die, a figure burst from the shadows, slicing with a machete with terrifying speed and accuracy. It was David. He had broken through his paralysis, a look of grim determination on his face. He hacked at the creature with unyielding fury, severing limbs, chopping at its antlers, and forcing it back into the darkness from whence it came. The monster faded off into the quicksands of the pine where it belonged, scattering feathers whilst the use of its wide wingspan let loose a subconscious sense of fright that remained half a mile away from Helga. The other campers huddled close together, shaking not only from cold and rain but from the raw, very real fear of what they had seen. Mark was seriously injured, but alive. Sarah wrapped him up to the best of her ability, her hands shaking. What was that thing? David, he said hoarsely. Sarah stared at him, her eyes heavy with a deep sadness. I don't know, David, but I believe we simply encountered something very ancient and very wicked. And I don't think it's the last time we will see it. The rest of the night they huddled around the dying embers of the fire, listening to the wind howl through the trees, every rustle and snap sounding like the advance of something monstrous. They understood, with a sick certainty, that they were no longer out camping in the woods. They were ensnared in a waking nightmare, hunted by a wood that clothed itself in skins. And they knew, deep down, that they would never be free. They were lost to the forest now, and sooner or later, the forest would return for what remained. The storyteller's curse. The fire crackled as it spat defiant sparks into the inky canvas of the night. The scent of wood smoke blended into the damp, earthiness of the forest, a familiar comfort, normally. But here tonight, an undercurrent of subtle discomfort ran skin deep, a sensation heightened by the shadows that waltzed with wicked glee just outside the reach of the firelight. The doctor, Sarah, the professor, Mark, the writer, Emily, the storyteller, David. They were longtime friends held together by years of joyful and sad experiences. Camping had become a tradition for them, though an escape from the imploring demands of their lives, to get back to the sweet, unrefined horrors of nature. David, the consummate performer, held court. Jacked up on cheap beer and the excitement of an audience hanging on his every word, he told a long, exaggerated story about a local legend. "They tell you this forest is old," he boomed, his voice echoing against the silence of this place, "older than any map can tell you. And dwelling at the center of it all is the birch witch." He let it hang for effect, his eyes shining in the firelight. Sarah rolled her eyes, but a faint smile hovered on her lips. "Davy, you and your tall tales. Birch witch is one of those things that just doesn't exist." "Oh, but there is Sarah, there is," David said, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She's a spirit, older than the birches themselves. They say she was a woman scorned, and that her lover betrayed her here in this very forest. Now she wanders, always in search of revenge. But she doesn't prey on just anyone. Oh no, she hunts liars." He leaned in, his face lit by the flickering flames. "They say that if you tell a lie in her woods, she hears it. And she'll come for you. She'll drag you, shrieking, to the heart of her birch tree, where you will be entwined in its gnarly, twisted roots, forever a prisoner in its silent woodland pain." Embellishing, he described the gnarled features of the witch, her birch-bark skin, her skeletal fingers that could twist a man's soul in knots. He described the rustle of leaves that presaged her arrival, and the stench of wet earth that announced her presence. Emily, who typically lived in her own world of words, was transfixed. Her big, dark eyes pulled wide as she took in every detail, her imagination taking flight. Mark, though laughing in the same tone, watched uneasily at the trees around their campsite. Sarah, however, was skeptical. "David, you're just making this up as you go along, aren't you?" David laughed, a beat too harshly. "Maybe, maybe not. It's just a story, Sarah. Just a bit of fun." But even as he spoke, his eyes scanned the campsite, as if looking for something or someone. As the night wore on, the story hung over the atmosphere, a cloud over a party. Then they retired to their tents, the only sound the crackle of the fire. But sleep was elusive. They were impotent against the whisper of leaves when it grew as loud and as sinister. The shadows appeared to lengthen, grotesquely distorted. Sarah turned in her sleeping bag, putting her unease down to a late night and David's overactive imagination. But there was a nagging sense of dread that loomed over her, a visceral fear that nagged at the back of her mind. Then, she heard it. A soft, regular tap, like skeletal fingers tapping on a tree. It was coming from just outside their tent. Terror seized her. She clenched her eyes tight and hoped it was nothing but a branch brushing the canvas. But the tapping got louder, more insistent, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the ground. The tent fabric tore all of a sudden, a ripping, shredding sound that pierced the silence. Sarah screamed, a strangled sound that faded into the enormity of the woods. She opened her eyes to a scene of unthinkable horror. Gnarled, clawed branches as thick as a man's arm had thrust through the tent, and their rough bark had scraped against her skin. They were twisted and deformed birch branches, their leaves whispering, inaudibly, in a language she didn't understand. Next to her, Mark sat frozen in terror, his eyes wide with disbelief. He attempted to scramble backward, but the branches were faster, stronger. They coiled around his legs and pinned him to the ground. "Sarah, help me," he shouted, and his tone quaked with primal, unfiltered terror. She tried to contact him, or free him, but was frozen in terror. Sharpened branches grasped Mark tightly as they dug into him. He let out another scream, a shrill and horrifying scream that reverberated off the trees. Then, with a disgusting crack, he disappeared. Drawn under bough and the ground darkened. There was just the dusty, ancient air of the land, and the branches tapping away. She crawled out of the split tent, heart pounding in her chest. She picked her way through the brush, fleeing the nightmare she had just witnessed. She ran until her lungs felt as if they would burst and her legs cried out in protest. But she couldn't shake the sense she was being watched. she discovered Emily huddled near the dying embers of the fire, her face pale and tear-streaked. "David is dead," Emily whispered, trembling. "He was taken." They fumbled their way back to the campsite, their minds swirling in shock from the horror they had seen. The tent was a twisted heap of fabric, the smell of sap and terror hanging heavy in the air. There was no sign of David. When dawn broke and the trees glowed with a pale, otherworldly light, they heard it again. A low, twisted voice sounded, apparently passed out of the trunk of the largest birch tree next to their campsite. It was David's voice, but it was different, hollow, steeped in an ancient malice. "You should not have told a lie," the voice rasped, the words scraping the silence like fingernails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have been telling stories that weren't yours to tell." Emily and Sarah looked at the birch tree, feeling their blood run cold. The bark appeared to writhe and twist, and the branches extended like probing claws. The birch tree bore a new scar, a growth-like protrusion, as if an entire branch were ejected from the tree. And inside, they could make out the blurry, shadowy outline of a figure trapped for all eternity in the roots of an ancient tree. They ran, but the forest would not let them escape the nightmare they had unleashed. The night remained the fifth for their lips as they buried the memory in their subconscious, hoping if they didn't speak of it, the storyteller's curse would be lifted. But sometimes, when the wind howls and the trees rustle in the dead of night, they can still hear it. The whispering, distorted voice from the depths of the forest, "You shouldn't have lied." And they know, with a bone-chilling certainty, that the birch witch is still out there, waiting, listening, for the next unwitting soul to tell a story that isn't theirs to tell. The forest remembers these lies, and the forest always takes its due. Searched my pack and pulled out a portable charger. A few minutes of nervous waiting later, the screen flared to life, and sure enough, a single, unread voicemail registered. My breath hitched. I paused, a primal urge telling me to stop and leave it alone. But curiosity, that insidious siren song, tugged me ahead. I pressed play. The sound of a woman's voice, choked with panic, echoed in the glade. "We're lost. I don't get it. The map, it keeps changing. Something's watching us. I can feel it. David's gone. He went out for water and never returned. Please, anyone, if you're reading this, turn back. Just turn around." The voicemail cut off, static swallowing the words. I dropped the phone as though it had scalded me. My heart thudded in my chest, a panicked percussion against the suffocating stillness. I told myself it was only an optical illusion, a trick of the echo, a distortion of the woods. But I felt it too, that cold tingle on the back of my neck. A subtle sense of being watched, scrutinized by something unseen, of something nefarious. The days turned into a surreal nightmare. I painstakingly recorded everything, sketching out the campsite, taking photos of the debris, retrieving the cell phones. I attempted to rationalize the voicemail, to account for the disappearances, but each attempt collapsed under the burden of the inexplicable. The journals were the worst. They painted a terrifying portrait, each one repeating the same descent into madness. Trails lost and winding and twisting, shadows caught in the corner of a vision, the gnawing, ever-present sense of being hunted. They wrote of voices, whispers in the wind that beckoned with knowledge, secrets, but enacted a toll. Gradually, insidiously, the glade started to get to me, and so I slept fitfully, troubled by vivid nightmares filled with trees of goblins and eyes glowing in the dark. I started seeing things, too. Shadows that moved slightly out of the corner of my eyes, the white of a figure between trunks. One night, sitting in front of the fireplace, holding a notebook in my shaking hands, I heard it. A whisper, borne on the wind, soft and sibilant, like the rustling of dry leaves. "Elias." I froze, every muscle tense. I scanned the surrounding woods, didn't see anything. "Hello," I called, my voice a hoarse croak. The whisper came again, closer, clearer this time. "You're here because we didn't tell Elias." Fear, cold and clammy, seized me. I got to my feet. My head was throbbing. I had to get out. I needed to get out of this cursed place, before I really did get sucked in. I threw my gear into the pack with wild urgency, fumbling with the straps. As I was turning away, I noticed it. At the edge of the clearing, shrouded in ghostly moonlight, stood a figure. Tall and famished, its features lost in shadows. It was impossibly still, yet I could feel its gaze, heavy and penetrating, piercing into my soul. "Do not leave, Elias," it rasped, its voice a dry, scratching whisper. "We have so many things to show you." I didn't wait to hear more. I ran, tearing through the woods, lungs on fire, heart threatening to explode. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, the trees reaching out like skeletal fingers, trying to snag me, pull me back. I ran for hours, an animal fear overcoming all reason. When I finally tripped back onto the trailhead, the first brushstrokes of dawn were setting the sky ablaze. I kept running until I was by my jeep, breathless and shaking. For the next few days, I was in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I could not let go of the sensation that I was still being watched, that the image of the woods was now etched into my soul. But then one morning it dawned on me. My compass. I recalled setting it down on the ground at a spot near a distinctive large, strangely shaped hemlock tree. It was a little thing, an inexpensive compass, but the fear it unlocked made a new tide of dread wash over me. I knew I had to go back, not to investigate, not to expose the truth, but to recover my compass, to break free of the final material bond to Hemlock Glade. I came back to the glade in the cruel light of midday, hoping the sun would banish the darkness that clung about the place. But the sense of foreboding remained, heightened by the suffocating quiet. I easily spotted the hemlock tree. The compass lay on its back as I remembered. As I crouched down to pick it up, I noticed something else. 2 words scratched into the bark of the tree, just below the compass. "Turn around." My blood ran cold. I knew, with a nauseating certainty, that I was not alone. I rose slowly, hand moving toward the knife in my belt. And then I saw them. They crept out of the trees, slowly, silently, their shapes flickering and blurring in the dappled sunlight. They were the lost campers, and yet, they weren't human anymore. Their eyes were empty sockets, smoldering behind some unholy light. Their skin was pulled tight against their bones, and there had developed a thin layer of moss and lichen covering them. Vines wrapped around their extremities, tethering them to the woods. They had become part of the woods, extensions of its will. And they wanted me to come in with them. They started to close in, their soundless approach more terrifying than any scream. I knew I couldn't fight them. I knew I couldn't escape. The grove did not seek answers. It did not want to be understood. It wanted to assimilate, to consume, to incorporate me into its swelling body. As they reached for me, their gnarled and skeletal hands outstretched, I closed my eyes and waited for the tree's embrace. With an eerie certainty, I understood that Hemlock Glade was not merely a site of disappearances. It was a cemetery of souls, a testament to the forest's insatiable hunger. And I was its next offering. This is the final campsite, I thought. The campsite out of which no one really leaves. We just become a bit of it. And maybe one day another unsuspecting soul will find this place, discover my journal, listen to my voicemail, and hear my whispering warning. Turn around.